multi-hazards, all affecting communities.
Hello everybody, this is Vin Nelsen with Multi-Hazards. Today I'm very happy to have a wonderful guest, myself. It's solo time. So, just joking around here. Now, before I do anything and everything, I will say a territorial acknowledgement because I'm living on First Nations land here outside of Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. Now, the reason I do this, it's not tokenism. It's not like, oh yeah, I have to do this because, it's a thing to do in Canada, or because I have to salve my guilty conscience or anything like that. But it's because I've done a lot of research on our history here in Canada. I've met a lot of First Nations people. I've met Métis people. I've met Inuit people. And I have a very deep respect. I'm against white supremacy. I'm against this racism that has been here from all along, from colonialism, from imperialism, and I'm against it. And I am pro-Indigenous as much as a white guy can be, and I'm trying to grow in that area, even though it's not easy because I grew up in a totally different context, but I just want to try my best. And I hope that my listeners here, you will do the same, and you will respect and honor Indigenous people, not just giving them lip service, but through action. And that is something that white people can do. Because listen, if you can be a white supremacist, if you can be a racist, then on the flip side, you can be an anti-racist, right? You can be a natural supremacist. You believe nature is supreme, and the diversity in nature, in humans, in plants and animals, this whole world that we live in is diverse, and you don't put yourself above nature. You don't put yourself above other human beings. You can do that. So here we go. I'm going to say the territorial acknowledgement, and it's coming from Kwantlen Polytechnical University, or KPU, near where I live. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, and you could probably put a First Nations name on that, Halkomelem language, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Coquitlam peoples. And so these are the names of various First Nation groups who are around me here in Greater Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the solo project. So today, what we're doing is we're discussing this article that I wrote. Now, I was contacted on LinkedIn through, Mark Heim, Dr. Mark Heim. He does a disaster doc blog, and he said, okay, can you write something around 900 words? And I did. So the title of this article I wrote, this was like a month ago, it's called Disasters Mirror Society. So what I'm going to do here is, first of all, I'm going to read the whole thing. And then I'd like to just go through the article again and just kind of explain some things as we go. Now, I wrote a little message to Dr. Mark Heim on LinkedIn before I sent this to him. And I said, this piece I wrote is fairly heavy, and some quote-unquote white folks may feel uncomfortable because I mention how our system is a pecking order with us, is it us or we? European whites on top in general, of course, I'll put that in brackets, and BIPOC, so that is Black, Indigenous, people of color. And you can include Latinos or Latinx on there. There's so many people you could put in there, just anybody who's not European white. All right? And so the others are, of course, in our society, lower on the pole, right? Lower on the societal ladder. So this unjust reality mirrors and plays out when disasters strike. However, when we hear the news, we say, oh, more blacks and Latinos are dying from COVID. What a surprise! Or, wow, I wonder why most of the worst hit by that hurricane there, or this drought or flood here, are people of color. I wonder why. So we see that in the media all the time. There's this kind of like surprise that happens over, people who before the disaster were already kind of living on the edge of survival. And then after the disaster, they've been pushed over the edge. And then the people who were living well before the disaster, in general, are living well after the disaster. And it happens over and over and over again, and we never seem to learn. So, in a recent Multi-Hazards podcast, I had a very famous and expert emergency manager, Vince B. Davis, and so we covered these issues together in detail. And so my point in all this is that pre-disaster inequities are worsened during and after disasters. So we can do something about the perpetual vulnerable, as you call them. Yes, we can, and we'll all benefit. The question is, are we willing? Are we willing? Or will we just go to Twitter and other partisan news outlets and we'll just continue our little cat fights? Well, people still have these hardships and it gets worse and worse. Now, I'm trying to push for good to triumph over the negative. And although I'm Canadian, many American realities play out here in Canada, but on a smaller or different scale. Because as a Canadian, we're always looking at what's going on in the United States. We pay attention to it a lot. And of course, here in Canada, our population is actually less than the state of California. But we are a descendant, or we are an offspring of the British Empire, just like the United States. We haven't become as big and powerful as them, but we are an important country in the world in Canada here, and this racism has just permeated our entire system. And so when it comes to disaster management, or they call it at the United Nations, they call it disaster risk reduction, well, it's the same people before the disaster who are usually hurting after disaster. So I'm going to get to reading the article word for word right now. Just hold on a second. Disasters mirror society. There are no natural disasters. So several experts in disaster management often use social media to promote this message. Indeed, for our societies, it's the human element that is the key to who survives and who doesn't. In my recent Multi-Hazards podcast interviewing seasoned emergency manager Vincent B. Davis, he quoted United States Army General Russell Honore from a conference where Honore was guest speaker. And Honore said, "One's ability to survive in a disaster is directly related to what they were doing before the disaster." So this doesn't mean we're the people at work, in a football field, or going through the drive-thru. What it does point out is this: what were these people's social situation? Were they at the top, middle, or bottom of the societal ladder? Did they have enough money for insurance? Was their housing adequate? Did they have power and position in society? Connections? Resources? Do they have any tools or training to survive a disaster? Disasters mirror what was already going on in a society or community. The quote-unquote vulnerable aren't vulnerable by fate or bad luck. They're there because we put them there. Why have Black, Indigenous, Latinx or Latino, and other people of color, BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, been the worst hit by the COVID-19 pandemic in North America? The reason is that our own racism as white people has fueled discrimination by banks, city halls, police forces, universities, and other important institutions. The system serves us. The system fails them. Other questions abound. If black people are carded, harassed, and even killed by police, can they rely on them and other emergency responders in a crisis? If City Hall officials are known to discriminate against BIPOC and others in normal times, will they be trusted during and after disaster strike? Can indigenous communities situated near factories or extraction sites breathing in toxic fumes every day have faith that government officials will help during a disaster? In fact, racism not only hurts BIPOC votes, but all of society, including whites. Economic and social policy expert Heather McGhee made this point in her 2021 book, The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Our current system began with imperialism, when Europeans invaded the New World, waging war to access land and resources, committing genocide, and marginalizing indigenous peoples. So this was from page 9 of McGee. Chattel slaves were imported from Africa for free work. Other cheap labor was brought in from Asia, India, the Pacific Islands, etc. The eventual result was a quote-unquote zero-sum hierarchy where Europeans were winners and the people of color losers. History has bequeathed us a quote-unquote winner-takes-all system that continues to divide up society into haves and have-nots. While some white people are poor and some BIPOC folks well off, the system still favors one group at the expense of others. One more recent example is in McGee's research was the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. It showed how disaster and collapse await societies built on this zero-sum pecking order. And that was from Chapter 4 in McGee. The U.S.'s top banks targeted black homeowners who already had good credit and access to low-interest loans to refinance with subprime loans. And McGee proves that on page 69. The sales teams were downright predatory, harassing blacks and Latinos with repeated phone calls of solicitation. Using skilled deception, the salespeople succeeded at moving these homeowners over to inferior loans with accelerating interest rates, which caused many to eventually foreclose, which was the aim of the banks all along. These subprime loans, despite their collateral damage at the end of the pipeline, were separated and sold on Wall Street. Spurred on by government deregulations, the fraud went on for years, starting with communities of color and later conning white homeowners nationwide. The Wall Street trading frenzy in rebundled packages of subprime loans eventually became the house of cards that collapsed, causing an American and international financial crisis. Everyone was finally affected, but it all started when banks deceived people of color and then white communities. And a financial crisis is often much worse than the worst of tornadoes or hurricanes. Heather McGee's point is that the zero-sum game here makes us all sitting ducks. when BIPOC communities experience systematic racism in banking, policing, schooling, work, healthcare, etc., the entire system suffers, including white folks. And if an unjust society is limping along in the best of times, woe to us all when disaster strikes. A similar point was made by New Scientist writer Deborah McKenzie in her 2020 book, COVID-19, The Pandemic That Never Should Have Happened and How to Stop the Next One. McKenzie compares our globalized, industrialized society to a big game of Jenga. That's on page 156 of her book. And Jenga, I think you could pronounce it Yenga too in the original language. Collapse occurs when we pull out enough of the pieces. In complex societies, people are key, and even more so as complexity rises. For example, our economies are now dependent on quote-unquote just-in-time deliveries. With the COVID-19 pandemic striking communities with sickness and death, especially now that mutating variants spread and kill at higher rates, disruptions are rampant. As McKenzie states on page 158 and 159, more inequality and more poverty means more risk. Deborah McKenzie, nearly 1 year ago, also foreshadowed our current vaccine distribution predicament. She said on page 135, a hostile global competition for vaccine access and ownership would be tragic. If some parts of the world are vaccinated and others aren't, the disease will continue to spread and mutate. There is a risk that this could make our present vaccines obsolete. We all end up suffering. The pecking order, the zero-sum game, makes daily life a living hell for marginalized communities. Eventually, it hurts everyone. Disasters are a mirror. The pre-disaster situation simply gets replayed in new, horrifying ways, with collateral damage spreading far and wide. Loving ourselves isn't enough. In a diverse and complex society where we all depend on each other, loving our neighbor is not an option, but a responsibility. Whoo-wee, that was a mouthful. Now let's go back here to the very beginning, disasters mirror society. Now, it's funny, on Twitter, you got these people, it's like, they keep repeating, there are no natural disasters, there are no natural. So they're focusing on the word natural, because the media likes to say natural disasters. So I think, for example, at the university where I studied, Simon Fraser University, outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, they would call these geohazards, right? So these are coming from the geography, or you could also say from the climate. So they're natural in that sense. But the people say there are no natural disasters. They're saying that it's the human element that's the key, right? Because, for example, there could be an earthquake, there could be a volcano erupting, there could be whatever, tsunami, and it's not a big deal if nobody lives there, right? Well, it'll hurt the animals, it'll hurt the plant life, but if nobody's living there, it's not really going to be reported in the media, right? So it's always the human element, because people are building where they shouldn't be building their homes or businesses or industries. People are, doing things they shouldn't be doing. Society as a whole, I'm saying. And so when the disaster strikes, it's kind of like this happened because of the pre-disaster situation. And so that's what this article is focusing on. And I love that quote by U.S. Army General Russell Honore. One's ability to survive in a disaster is directly related to what they were doing before the disaster. So now it could be conceived that I'm misquoting him here, because apparently he was talking more about like people having emergency kits or not, or having specific training or resources to battle a disaster. But I would widen it to mean that if people's general condition before disaster is such and such, it's going to be the same or worse after disaster. Right? Now, of course, there are exceptions, because you look at the situation in California and the U.S. when they have the wildfires, and there's some wealthy communities that end up getting dispossessed, relocated, because their whole town has burnt down. Now, I did a little research on that, and it seems that, now if you're from California, you can correct me, but it seems that people are moving into these neighborhoods that developers make that are further and further into the forest and into the mountains. And one reason is because the cities in California, their home prices have just gone sky high. And so people are kind of going out of city and going further and further into these mountainous areas. And when a huge wildfire comes, sometimes there's only one road in, one road out, or there's a lack of different routes or routes that people can take to get out. So you could say that that problem is also connected to economics, because why are people moving into areas where, before there might have been just like a few people, or say indigenous people living there, but then now there's these suburban people moving out there. So, anyways, these are big questions of disasters mirroring what's going on in a society or community. Now, the reason this is important, because I studied for 2 years emergency management, and in some places they call it disaster management or crisis management, or the United Nations calls it disaster risk reduction. But it seemed to me that this field, it's just woefully funded. And for example, my city has 500,000 people, no emergency manager. They have this little program, little thing going on, but it's basically run out of the fire department, and they don't seem to be doing that much. So it's an undervalued field, and some people would argue that emergency management is not even a field. Now in the US, they have FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, so at least that gives the field kind of legitimacy. But where I live in Canada, you'll have a lot of towns, a lot of cities, a lot of places where they have like hardly anybody or nobody doing disaster management work. And as I said before, it's undervalued. People don't even see it's necessary. Some people even argue it's not a real field. But me personally, I think it's the key to our future with all the disasters that are going to be striking us from climate change and other reasons. We need to have a field that is holistic, that looks at the big picture. And right now, emergency management is not it. But it should be it. For example, I saw on LinkedIn there was one professor from Waterloo that I had interviewed about climate change adaptation. And he said, well, they should have in every city, every major city, an expert who will have a deep knowledge of all the disasters that could strike that city. Now, is that supposed to be like an academic who's in that position, or should it be the emergency manager? Anyways, I can't solve these problems right now, but just to tell you that disasters are really most people's radar. Like look at COVID-19. There were epidemiologists or people who had looked into and researched diseases, including the one that the right always loves to hate, Bill Gates, he actually had read up on epidemics, and he was warning, saying, well, from what I can see, from what I've been reading, a pandemic is totally possible. And so I'm not just saying that Bill Gates is a prophet. A lot of epidemiologists, people who study diseases, people in the health field were saying that just with all our international travel, this can happen. So it's not what they call a black swan, which is a disaster that sort of comes out of nowhere and just hits you and you couldn't have predicted it. This was actually predicted. And I believe it was in Johns Hopkins University back in, October or November 2019, before they had discovered this disease of COVID-19 coming out of Wuhan, China. So they had actually done, they call it an exercise or drill with a lot of different agencies for a pandemic. And then there you go. It happened. And of course, conspiracy theorists will say, well, they actually planned the pandemic. No, they were doing a drill. They were doing an exercise to see what if. And the what if, in some senses, came true. I don't know if it helped the people who did the drills, but hopefully it did. Maybe one day we'll hear their story. So, if you think about it, whatever's happening pre-disaster will be exacerbated post-disaster. Now, here's a question. Some people wondering, why there are not more climate change activists who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, or other people of color. Why is it a lot of white people? And then I heard that people are saying, well, listen, if people in their daily life are living on the edge, and for example, they leave their home, walking to the bus or going somewhere by foot or driving a car or taking transit, whatever, taking the Uber or Lyft or taxi, and they're worried about police stopping them and carding them, asking for ID. They're worried that if they reach to their wallet to grab their ID card, that the police are going to tase them or shoot them. What a ridiculous situation. What was it, a year or two ago? Even an Australian white woman came to visit the United States, and she had been just in a car and the police just shot her through the window. And I'm thinking, what kind of policing system do we have in many communities in the United States and Canada? Just ridiculous that people should be fearing police. Like, of all things, police are there. They're proclaiming to serve and protect. And it's like, okay, who are you serving? Are you just serving the elite? The people who are, connected to you folks and the people in City Hall? Who are you serving? And protect. And are you protecting them too? But you're not protecting the Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color. You're not even protecting the lower income whites. You're only the upper income whites. What kind of ridiculous is this? Now, do you think if a disaster comes, anything will change? When you have systemic racism already going on in the banks, in the police forces, in the universities. Universities! I mentioned before, I went to Simon Fraser University. I got a bachelor, double major. One was communications, which is media studies, and the other one was French. Yes, and I got a liberal arts certificate also when I was there for 5 years in the end of the 80s, 85 to 1991. And guess what? It was I think last year, where there was an alumni, just like me, an alumni, went back to Simon Fraser University, was sitting, eating in the cafeteria. I think it was before COVID. And the security guard comes, and then the police come. So yeah, I'm looking at this article from the Tyee, and it was actually from March the 26th. So it went back, and this incident actually happened December 11th last year. So it's actually during the pandemic. And so a security guard comes in, singles out this 30-year-old alumni student whose family name is Fatoba, and he just wanted to buy something at the cafeteria there. So the security guard singled them out and asked for ID. Now, ask for ID? Like, I never get asked for ID as a white person. I don't get it, right? And so this is why white people like you or me, if you are white, we need to study anti-racism, because there's some things that just boggle your mind that happen to people of color that never happened to us. So the security guard tells this person, Fatoba, to buy his food and leave. He asks why he's being singled out. Oh, and guess what? The guard radios a request to call the RCMP. And guess what? The school where I studied emergency management, won't say the name, they probably trained this guard, and that guard had to actually pass the test given by my former university. So why is that relevant? Well, I'm just saying is that who's training these guards, right? I actually took that security guard training, and yeah, they don't have anything about racism as far as I can see there in the training. So this security guard was like racist, basically, singling out this fellow who is of African ancestry. And then the police come. And oh yeah, they make a statement, right? The RCMP says, yes, we used a crisis intervention and verbal de-escalation techniques. Yeah, right. And then they pepper spray the fellow and then put him in a chokehold. And then use a taser. Right. And you got to remember, this is like months and months after the whole Black Lives Matter protests that happened throughout the US and then also in Canada. And so these people, the security guard and also the police, they have to know that, you do this kind of stuff, especially against black people in Canada, you're going to be videotaped and you're going to be in trouble. So then, unbelievable. And then they charge this person, Fatoba, for, creating a disturbance, obstructing and assaulting a peace officer. I don't believe it. It's just like, if you let the fellow just buy the food, do his thing. If it was a white guy, would you do all that? Right? You have to make all this drama because, you're singling out people of color. Right? This is unbelievable. And then the university will be like, oh yeah, whatever. We're getting some we're getting some recommendations from internal experts, and then we will have a conversation about campus safety in the coming months. And it's all this institutional BS, right? All this runaround. And there you go. This is at my alma mater, Simon Fraser University. So let's go back to the text here. It is, if you were, I'm talking to you white people, if you were treated like this, like all the time, you couldn't trust the banks, you couldn't trust the police, you couldn't trust the, security guards at your university. You had to think people are going to be singling you out all the time. And you might go months and months and nothing happens, but you're always fearful of this one incident. And that incident could not only injure you, but it could take your life. And then your family loses you, a loved one. So think about the fear and the trauma that people who are of color going around in society. And usually white people, we just, walk out our door and la-di-da-di-da, right? Especially if you're a man. Women have it kind of harder. They can't walk in certain places at certain times. But men, we're kind of like, yeah, we have this, what do you call it? The myth of invulnerability. We have this aura about us that nothing bad will happen to us. And in fact, it often doesn't happen to us, but it does happen to people of color. So let's go down in the article here, talking about the book. Now, this is a wonderful book. I'm halfway through. Heather McGhee. It was published in the last couple of months. It's called The Sum of Us, what racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together. Now, Heather McGhee, she's done a lot of interviews. I actually got to know her through a Trevor Noah video. And I love Trevor Noah. I just love his take on politics or whatever he's saying. He's a funny guy. But he was on, Heather McGhee was on the Daily Show of Trevor Noah. And then she's been on a lot of podcasts, a lot of interviews. And this book has got a lot of mileage. Even though I'm Canadian, we use kilometers here. But she keeps talking about zero-sum hierarchy. And that is the game. You notice that in Canada, where I live, in the United States, many countries, it's zero-sum. Winner takes all. Right? And this system we have created, in the end, it favors white people. And I wouldn't just say any old white people. There's this elite. Right? And it's really ironic that you've got all these people who are like right-wing conservative, and then some people go further to the alt-right and they become white supremacist. And a lot of the times they're poor. And their situation is a lot like people of color, right? Who are struggling to, survive in this hierarchy. And it's like, why are they even joining with this, elites and supporting them? That's why I couldn't figure out during the Trump years. And now we have all these people, they haven't changed. Trump is out, but these people, even in Canada, they're still around. And a lot of times they're not the elite, right? But they'll fight to the death to protect the elite. It's just amazing. And then they will accuse anybody else who is trying to stand up for social justice as, oh, you're like Naziistic. You're 1984 from George Orwell, right? You're trying to control things. And it's like, you've been conned, you've been duped, you've been brainwashed by rich, usually white elites. And you should actually be siding with people of color because your economic status is very much connected to theirs. And I don't know why, but your white skin has not worked for you to give you privilege. You've had some privileges. You don't have to worry about getting arrested as much as people of color. But in fact, you're still pretty broke overall. And you should actually be supporting people of color, not the rich white elite. So this is something I don't understand about politics right now, but it's happening. People have been brainwashed and duped to not look at it from a holistic point of view, look at society as a whole. And that's what Heather McGhee is doing. She's trying to prove that, you take away things from black people, well, in the end, it'll end up taking away things from white people. So she's trying to say that we need to prosper together, right? Not have this whole divide and conquer thing. And then you get the Jeff Bezos and these other people of the world. And, so many people living off the stock market, and they just keep getting richer and richer and richer. And you think, oh, they're just smarter and harder working than everybody. No, they're not. No, they're not. A lot of people who are in the lower classes are extremely hardworking. So it's not a matter of who's working harder or not. It's a matter of having the connections to that elite or being part of that elite, and that whole thing kind of works for you. But for most of us, it doesn't work. So white people, if you are supporting the rich elites of our society, you need to stop that. And you need to look around and look at the people who are in your community or in other communities who are at the same economic level as you, and you need to take social action and stop being racist, right? So this was actually pointed out in a book that I read by Howard Zinn, and it was called The People's History of the United States. And again, he kept saying that what happens, instead of people supporting each other at the same economic level, the elites, they will use racism to divide and conquer. All right, so let's go back to the text here that we're talking about Heather McGhee, and she talks about the financial crisis of 2007-2008. Now, I can remember that time. Fortunately for me, I was an employment counselor. And even in Canada, not too far from the US border, we had so many people being affected by this financial crisis, which is actually from the United States. It's so funny. I don't think we ever blame the Americans, right? People will blame China for the COVID-19 virus and blame and blame and blame. But why don't we blame Americans for sending us this financial crisis, right? We have so many companies here where I live that are American, right? It's unbelievable. We had this very popular outdoor store, and they had wonderful outdoor clothing. So it's called Mountain Equipment Co-op, MEC. And it got bought out by Americans. And it happens all the time, right? So I think sometimes we need to protest all this American domination of our country. Yeah? Anyways, I'm not anti-American at all. I understand that they've had a colonial history and we've had a colonial history. But we're talking about the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And it affected Canada. And a lot of it started, people were saying, the rumors were going around that, oh yeah, black people started this. It's like, come on. It's Wall Street. It's the banks who started this, right? And they're saying, well, they were giving out loans to people who shouldn't have had the loans in the first place. Yeah, they shouldn't have had the loans because these people actually, they were not like people who couldn't have loans. These were people, and this is Heather McGee. She points it out on page 69 from the research that her and her organization had done. These people already had good credit, right? They were able to apply for low interest loans, and they had them. People had already been having good mortgages at that time, and so they were conned into refinancing with subprime loans. And you should read what Heather McGee is saying. She said some people even used religion, right? You know, they had some religious symbol on the wall and they're kind of like, you know, oh yes, the white person who is the sales person, they would be like, oh, you know, we have the same religion, you know, and they're kind of like putting out things, all this God talk, right? To try to convince these African American and also Latinx people to move over from their good home loans to these terrible ones which were subprime. So they were just using deceit. Now, I don't know why there aren't many, at least for what I could hear of, lawsuits against these salespeople, against these banks, right? Well, of course, they've got lots of legal counsel on their side. So, yeah, sucks to be the people who got conned, but it also ended up not just being people of color, but it ended up being a lot of white people getting conned into these subprime loans. So in my opinion, now this wouldn't even come up in emergency management, would it? Right? The whole issue of an economic crisis. But I like to look at things holistically. Now, I said something here in the text. I said, Heather McGee's point is that the zero-sum game here makes us all sitting ducks. Now, I like that metaphor, sitting ducks. Now, I don't know if in nature ducks actually just sit around and wait for, you know, something horrible to happen. But it is an appropriate metaphor that we are kind of just sitting there waiting for a disaster to happen because, in fact, this zero-sum game will make all the disasters worse. It will exacerbate these disasters for the people who are in normal life having a hard time, right? Now, moving on, we've got New Scientist writer Deborah McKenzie. And I got to say, I loved that book. I loved it. I had access to the 2020 book. This was like last August, after the pandemic had been going on here where I live from March, so March to August. So I listened to the audiobook as I was jogging, right? COVID-19, the pandemic that should never have happened, and how to stop the next one. It's funny how she said how to stop the next one. maybe she didn't have an idea that this one would just last so long. And then we have the variants, and they're just like, things are going crazy. But I like her discussions about complexity, because the problem in our society, and I'm in my 50s and I can see it now, and I don't know if younger people could see it as much, but things have been evolving here where we live. And our societies have become so complicated, so complex through globalization, through industrialization, and just so many things that were simple when I was younger, they're now just like super complicated. And you got to admit, some things have become easier, but there's so much complexity in the system, so that with this, we have the so-called just-in-time delivery. So we have everything happening just in time, just in time. So the supply chain is interrupted when a pandemic occurs. Now, I said this on another podcast. I do another podcast. It's called Be Strong to Be Useful, or Best Boo. But there's something tragic that happened in my family actually a couple of weeks ago. It is just heartbreaking, where a family member of mine, somebody I hadn't seen in a few years, so it wasn't very close, but died of an opioids overdose. Okay? Now, it sounds like, well, somebody was taking fentanyl and he overdosed on fentanyl. No, that's not it. What happens is the normal supply of whatever drugs people are taking locally here outside of Vancouver, the normal supply was interrupted. I don't know exactly how. It could be stopping things at the border, or people at the border, because we've had closed borders. Maybe things at the port, maybe at the Vancouver airport. But there's been disruptions in supply, and this has actually made something that was happening before, made it even worse, where somebody's normal drug, so for example, what's that thing called? Benzos. Benzos? Now, I don't know if I can even pronounce this. Benzodiazepines, or benzos. So, for example, a person is taking benzos, but instead of taking 100% benzos, somebody comes along and laces into the benzos fentanyl, right? Which is one of the opioids. And then this fentanyl is extremely powerful. A little bit will kill you. Well, guess what happens? It does kill people, right? And the other problem with the pandemic is that people have been using alone more and more, because they just don't have access to their friends as much as before, because we've been taught to social distance and to kind of keep away from other people. So people will use alone, so nobody's around to save their life. And then also their drugs are mixed with opioids. So this is tragic. This is very, very tragic. But this is an example of things that are going wrong because of disruption in the supply chain. And also this illustrates that whatever's happening before the disaster, like COVID-19, we already had an opioid epidemic. I think it's been 7 years where I live here. And it just gets worse and worse. Now we have the virus mutating, and now it's the end of April 2021, and apparently India is just so very bad, and they have a shortage of oxygen, and people are just dying, and they're cremating the bodies, and it's a really tragic situation. Now, I really like this quote from Deborah McKenzie. She said, "More inequality and more poverty means more risk." So, exactly. She was saying that, and I remember hearing this, she was saying that if you don't get the vaccine distributed fairly all over the world, well, okay, say we just vaccinate Canada, or where I live in British Columbia, Canada. I hate that name. British Columbia. Decolonize our name. But anyways, we get vaccinated, well, guess what? We have a border with Washington State. We have an airport. We have people coming in, right? And so just because we get vaccinated, what if many different parts of the world where we have people visiting or people from... I just got off the phone. I have a friend who had gone back to his country in Africa, right? Because somebody very near and dear to him had passed away in his family. So, and then he had to quarantine for 2 weeks. But you can see that just vaccinating your own population, yes, that will be good, but are you going to be able to seal yourself off from the rest of the world? That's hard. And also, it's, well, you could say that's also a human rights violation in some ways. People would conceive that. But it's not easy. And I think it's a human rights violation, honestly, to not end this pandemic sooner by doing the right things, taking the right steps. That's a human rights violation. Lockdowns are necessary as long as, it's not a million lockdowns because you keep screwing up on your response to the epidemic, right? If you do it right in the beginning, well, you will have a much greater chance of just nipping this thing in the bud. But of course, even in places like South Korea and Taiwan and New Zealand, they've had some reoccurrences, so they always have to deal with it. But where I live, I don't think we've done a good job on the epidemic compared to a lot of other places. Sorry, the pandemic. I think we could have done a lot better. So my point here is just to talk about the vaccine and getting it out there. If some parts of the world are vaccinated, others aren't, the disease will continue to spread and mutate. So there you go. And then, yeah, these vaccines that we have will just be, maybe they'll be obsolete. So we'll see what happens. This pandemic is not over, folks. So the point of this whole article is these disasters are just kind of mirroring. You think a big, huge mirror that's just kilometers wide, and it's just kind of hovering over your community like a UFO, and it's just mirroring back all the stuff, all the hurts, all the pains, all the suffering that are happening in normal life. And it just kind of flips over and things get worse and worse. So we're going to have to solve this pre-disaster problem. And I do think that people who are involved in emergency or disaster management or people involved in climate change adaptation, you have to think about this. You need to really take who the so-called vulnerable are very seriously. And this vulnerability, it might actually be you, and it might affect you. Might not affect you like directly, but indirectly it's going to affect many, many people. So this was my article, and it was in the disaster doc. It was a special guest blog, and thank you, Mark Heim, for allowing me to blog on that. I think it's going to disappear soon, but I have the text here, and I'm sharing it there. You can see there's a PDF for this. You can download the PDF. It has my text. So thanks, everybody, for listening, and I just want to say a little disclaimer that everything I've said is just my own opinion. It is not professional in the sense of being medical expertise or legal expertise. It's just my own opinion, and also it doesn't reflect the opinions, the values, the beliefs of any organization that I work for or volunteer for. So thanks, everybody, for listening. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelsen wishing you the best as you try to survive, you try to thrive during this pandemic and beyond. Thank you and peace out.